Hey everyone, it's going to be an exceptional interview today. I don't usually do a lot of interviews in English. I'm trying to get more people to interview in English, and I got lucky today. I'm joined by Alistair Ross. He's the mind behind Al's Retro Geek Lab and the Back to the BBS series, and also a seasoned cybersecurity leader. We're going to trace his journey from Scotland to New Zealand, how that move might have shaped his love of vintage machines, how modern security thinking informs his retro build. We'll talk about how BBSs are relevant in 2025, we'll talk about preserving old hardware and any projects he wants to tackle next. Alistair, welcome and thank you.
Alex, pleasure to be here today. Yeah, thanks for that lovely introduction. Quite humbling when you hear introductions like that. But yes, thank you very much for having me here today.
And thanks for, joining us, especially with the time difference. I mean, you guys are you're into retro, but you're technically in the future. It's already tomorrow morning for you guys. Um,
That's a good link.
yeah, it is. Now, just let's start with the origins of what you're doing with Al's Geek Lab. What's the earliest machine or the earliest moment that hooked you on computers and technologies, and what about it still resonates with you today?
That's a very good question. It's really, I think, I think a lot of people in the retro computing game, whether they just do it to tinker and do it for themselves, or whether they have a YouTube channel like me or something in between. I think that word nostalgia creeps up quite a lot. So I think it'd probably start with nostalgia. And it means different things to different people, but I think it has this effect on the brain, right? The brain is a really strange thing. When we um, feel and look, use all of our senses really, actually. When you think about it, there's the smell of old computers, right? When you switch on something from the 70s or 80s, there's that smell of the electronics warming up and the touch, the feeling of the old machines. And so when you do that, especially if you worked on those computers or whether you had them as games consoles or whatever your association with those machines were in the origin days, especially. So we're talking 70s and 80s, maybe the 90s, or for people who are a little bit younger than I am, then maybe the noughties as well. But I don't have so much association in that era. But back in the 80s and 90s, for me, there was they were associated with good times. For me, these computers were kind of like part of my formative years and part of something that was special to me because I could always rely on my computer. If I was annoyed at school, maybe I was having a bad day at school, or maybe I was, anything that was not quite right, I could always rely on my computer to do something for me, right? Because the computer will never say no. So in that, I guess I had affiliation with my computer that was always positive. So, kind of from that link, I guess there were these senses as I was talking about a moment ago. And so when those synapses are forming in your young brain, especially, they form this positive association. So many years later, when you see computers, especially those ones which were related to your formative days, or maybe even as when you're an adult. But there's an immediate throwback, and that throwback we call nostalgia. And it encompasses all of these senses, especially if those senses, these old computers with CRT monitors and the whirring fans and the noise, all of that, I think really causes the nostalgia overdrive. Because today, the computers that we have really don't have much of a smell. They don't have much of a touch. There's no, industrial feel to them. There's no big look. They're very quiet, all that sort of stuff. So to me, they're just other devices. And maybe, someday to somebody much younger than me, they'll go to these devices in 20, 30 years and go, oh, remember these, they were cool. But to me, they all kind of seem a bit vanilla. And we use them differently today. We use current devices just as tools. just as someone would pick up a calculator or a hammer or something like that. People don't generally get nostalgic for inanimate objects that we could use and fully replace every single day. Hammers and U-bends and whatever, right? They're just tools. The things in the everyday life. So I feel like the nostalgia for this particular period, I would say as far back as the 1950s, but general commodity computing really began in the 70s, late 70s, all the way through to the late 1990s. So anywhere in this space of time for a particular generation, I guess, we're fortunate to have this particular recall for nostalgia. And so I think that nostalgia really brought back this computing era for me. So when I became a certain age and I could look back at these computers and go, they were a lot of fun. So I started my computer journey out. I think the first thing we had was a console, and it was a hand-me-down. I can't remember how we got it into the house, but my mother had it lying around, and it was the Atari 2600, or it was actually, then it was known as the VCS, the video computer system, right? And it was this wood grain effect thing. And they just don't make things with wood grain effect. Like, not even in the 80s, to be honest with you, we're kind of dying out of the wood grain effect. The Atari 2600 or VCS came out in 1977, and it was very, very underpowered, potentially even for its time. But what the programmers did with that is make some absolutely classic games, or they ported classic games from the more powerful arcades. And even that today, I've got that very computer, I've got that console in my house. I've taken it over from the United Kingdom, where I'm originally from, Scotland, to be precise, as you said in your intro, and brought it over. And it's still got my tooth marks from when I was a kid, when I chewed the joysticks. So again, that thing I've brought it over because it brings back that nostalgia, right? And then the next thing we had was a ZX Spectrum, or in some parts of the world, it's called a Timex Sinclair or Timex 1000 or something like that. And then finally, we had an IBM PC XT, or clone to be precise. And that was a green screen, kind of what looked to be a business computer. And I think that was the computer that really cut my teeth and solidified what one could do on a computer. And it just opened up this massive, massive exploratory world with games, but also programming and so many cool things. So I think, look, I could go on and on and on about my computer journey, but I'll stop there and say that I think those were the initial things that really brought my journey of retro computing to the fore. And I think those were the things that I think back on now and go, wow, those were good times, actually. I might have said that at the time that they were kind of basic devices, but now looking back, they were really formative and nostalgic for me.
Definitely. For me, it's the smell of 5 1/4 inch floppies right out the box, or the
Yeah.
smell of the ink on the manuals, the massive manuals that would come with a lot of these devices. So yeah, there's definitely a sense of nostalgia there, and the feeling of opening like a gateway to so much that you didn't have access to unless you had a computer. Even more so when you get access to things like BBSs, which we'll get to in a moment. But first, you mentioned your Scottish roots. Now you're living in New Zealand. How did that move shape your relationship with retro tech in regards to things like access to gear, access to community, the stories that you want to tell, the change in, I don't know, plugs maybe? I don't know how different. I know the UK plugs are very famous for being really, really well engineered as compared to the plugs in other places and so on. How did that shape your journey?
Sorry, the last part there. The bugs, did you say?
No, the plugs, the leads, the
Oh,
yeah,
the electrical plugs.
for example.
Yeah. All right. Okay. The electrical wall socket plugs. Oh, well, I mean, sure. They're a good part to start. Um, and I can't remember the name of the woman who engineered those wall outlets, right? But she was a wonderful engineer, and I think what happened there is there was a heck of a lot of house fires, and electrical safety really wasn't a strong point in the world. It just wasn't, right? So, um, there was all sorts of elaborate uh, cabling in the world, and in the UK was absolutely no exception. And they had fabric around them, and they were two core. They didn't have proper earthing. They didn't have fusing. All these sorts of things. So they'd thrown down the gauntlet from this respect in the United Kingdom in the 1940s. I think it was just post-war. And I really am scratching my head to find the name of the woman, but she was a wonderful, wonderful engineer, and such a great story because it in that sort of period of time, it was the old boys club, right? It was all men saying, "Oh yeah, we know better," and so forth. And there's this poor woman all on her own, and she was just amazing. And amongst the many things that she did this design for a plug and electrical safety. Moreover, she knew a number of standards, and she developed this wonderful but massive plug. I mean, I don't know if all your viewers or listeners have seen the United Kingdom plug, but it is it's beefy. It's one among the biggest plugs and sockets in the world. But I would say that I would prefer it if they had that plug in New Zealand. They have a smaller version, but the UK British safety standard mandates that every plug be the same shape, the same size, and hold the fuses in them as well as the earth pin. So that level of safety has intrinsically increased the level of safety, I should say, in the UK since the 1940s, and no doubt saved hundreds or thousands of lives in doing so. So you really got to hand it to them. I mean, I'd much rather have that statistic than the fact that we have got the bulkiest plug in the world. So I'll take that any day. So again, I guess the reason why I labored on the fact of this plug is to talk about the level of engineering in computing as well as other scientific areas in both the United Kingdom and the United States of America. And I think there are many exceptions, of course, but I think there are a lot of great examples coming out of those two countries where computing standards were set and computing engineering. And I believe, Alex, you're part of the Internet Task Force or something like that,
The Internet Society,
the
Panama.
Internet Society, the ISOC, right? So the ISOC was created, I believe, by Vincent Cerf, one of the original people who was involved in the designing of the internet. And if you look at the sort of history of the ISOC, well, not just the ISOC, but the design of what became the internet, the ARPANET and so forth, this was created by Americans and British engineers across since the 1960s. And there was a heck of a lot of both hardware and software design, all the sort of networking, all the sort of protocols, all the rest. And they were developed a lot, principally by people in the United Kingdom and the United States. And there was a lot of solid engineering goals that were put into this. So things that you could have said at the time, potentially back in the 60s or 70s or 80s, that were considered almost over engineering because they were so thorough in their conceptual need, just like that plug. But then if you look at those concepts, you look at the designs, and you look at how they've been implemented back then, and they're still in design, and still in implementation to this very day. Those standards were designed so far ago, but then hold up, just like that plug, they hold up today. They are in use to this very day. TCP and IP, I don't know when they were, I think they were first made around 1982, something like that. It was a long, long time ago now. It was about
Actually, earlier,
40.
around the early 70s.
Right. Okay. So even older than that, right? Well,
Mhm.
IP, yes, IP certainly was
Mhm.
was a while back. So, um, you see that these standards were made and are still just as solid today as they were in the 70s or 80s. That's incredible that we have these standards that were made and still to have of all the things. The internet evolves every day, right? There are new things on the internet every day, but those core standards really have stood the test of time, which is wonderful.
Yeah, it's the closest thing we have to Roman concrete in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the main thing I would say about availability of retro tech in the UK and in America as well versus other parts of the world, including where I am now in New Zealand, is that there is a lot more of it in the UK and the US. I think a lot of that has to stem from the fact that it was made there principally. So there is an abundance, or less and less every year as people throw things out and things just get too hard to repair. But if you think about the a bit, this is where it was made. It was made in the US and the UK, whereas especially in New Zealand, which is like the literal bottom of the earth, right? It only gets very, very cold and very, very hard to reach after New Zealand. So we didn't innovate in ourselves that much here in New Zealand in terms of what we'd consider today retro hardware. We don't have a particular brand of computer that has stood the test of time. We made one called the Poly One, which was made for mainly education purposes, but in terms of its lifetime, it's probably only lasted 5 years or something. So we don't have that level of innovation where we certainly did in the US and the UK.
I do still see a lot of innovation coming from, places like there's a place in Mallorca, Spain, where I get stuff for like Amigas and Commodores. There's a lot of places in Eastern Europe where people are just coming out with so many new projects or emulating old hardware or even reproducing out of print stuff in a way that's really innovative in that regard. And I appreciate that. I hope that here in Latin America, we also start seeing a lot of that from, people who are also interested in keeping these devices alive. Now, besides keeping devices alive, you also want to document and keep alive the interest of the BBS, which is it was a major part of using these computers to access information, not just from around the country that you would live in. I remember here in Panama, we probably had around 15 or 20 BBSs at one point, which for a country of only 2 or 3 million people at the time, or maybe even 1.5, 2 million people in the 80s, it was a lot. What gap did you want to fill in the record regarding documenting the BBS scene, not just from back then but also for the modern BBS scene?
Yeah, great question. I mean, there is a resurgence of bulletin boards when I did that documentary. It was called Back to the BBS. I did it in 2021, and I think I put a lot of gusto into that because it was so formative for me, the bulletin board system, or BBS, that is. I did that because I was seeing this resurgence, and also it was COVID, so I had lots of time on my hands. So I made this 8-part documentary, which kind of covered a lot of things. And it was kind of like this fella, really cool fella called Jason Scott, and he does the Internet Archive amongst many other things. So he's a great archivist. Jason Scott did a series which was around 6 or 7 or 8 parts. I don't really know. It wasn't for a competition, but he called it BBS the documentary. I think that came out about the late 90s or early noughties. And that was a wonderful documentary because it really captured everything from the beginning of BBSes to what seemed to be the end of BBSes, right? And so he started the history of the BBS from when it was incepted in 1978 all the way through to really what people thought was the natural end of the BBS around the year 2000 or there around. And that was it. They had a little bit near the end of that documentary with the old sysops, the old maintainers of these BBSs, switching off. The power button literally was switched off on them. And I thought, well, that's pretty sad, but it was the truth. BBSs pretty much were switched off. Now, the bulletin board system, for those who have never used them and have never had that experience, I feel that that is an unfortunate thing, but it's, there was a period of time there from the year 2000 onwards where the internet had just skyrocketed, taken off, and, you know, people looked at the BBS and went, that is so antiquated. It's just a relic. Why would we want to do that when the internet can do all these amazing things? And so there for a period of probably 15 to 20 years, the BBS was pretty much dead and buried. And we thought that they would never come back. And then I think people started changing their minds and a whole bunch of things happened. COVID happened. People were at home a lot more. People looked into their hobbies and thought a few things. But I think the biggest thing that catalyzed the resurgence of the BBS was that people were getting disenchanted with the internet. We have a look at when the internet happened, the big explosion of it, when it was around 1995, 1996. We got onto the internet, it was like a world of possibility. Everybody was so enamored with it because you could do so many things. You could chat to people in IRC chat rooms. You could go onto Usenet and read news groups with people posting in forums and of different or similar likes. You could share files, and this new thing called the World Wide Web, you could go on and search for what seemed at the time unlimited content, and you could talk to people about the things that you were really interested in. So it was worldwide. Whereas a bulletin board, was a local thing. You would dial into it with your computer's modem, and it'd be a very nice warm place, but ultimately it was kind of limited by what the sysop, the maintainer of that BBS, was going to put up there, whether that was limited by the files or the space on their hard drive to share the files that they had, whether that was the topics of conversation in their FidoNet mailing list, or maybe it was the interests that the BBS was all about. So it was kind of clear to see that one was just almost unlimited and one was restricted. So there was a whole bunch of things, and I feel like that was fair enough. Now, what happened is the internet, there was this big greedy corporations that got involved, and they started taking over. And so we think about the internet in 2025, we've just shifted from something that was kind of like a theory to a reality, and that's called the dead internet theory. And we have more than 50% of the internet's users actually not being users. They're bots, right? They're search bots, they're chat GPT bots, whatever the bot may be, they're not human beings. So that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is we have these large corporations, whether that's Facebook, X, whatever you can think of, right? You think about going on the internet, there's probably a few websites that you go to. It's Google and Facebook and whatever, right? There's not that many websites that you go to. Whereas you go back to 95, 96, you would go on to hundreds or thousands of different websites. It wasn't all funneled through these very large, profitable corporations. So the internet of today has been homogenized. It's got this lens over it, which was not the case in the early days. And, even up until 2005, 6, 7, that sort of era, it was only then when the big corps really started taking over. So there was a shift over a relatively short period of time, and people got used to that. And then nowadays, people start hating it because they're like, what about the old internet? What about the internet that was a lot of fun, that was creative, that we could make GeoCities websites that we owned, that we had everything to do with, and it was never owned by a corporation. It was our own content, and it was just spread everywhere. It's very difficult to think now, Alex, of a time when we could go back to that, original internet, which was for us, by us, it was our own. And so if we think about how we could get back to that, a lot of people who knew about the bulletin boards, who were involved in bulletin boards, whether there were users, whether there were sysops, it doesn't matter, because they remember that time and go, I can't really bring the internet back to where it was because the internet's a sprawling, massive thing owned by corporations. But I could fire up that BBS software again and revisit that. So there were people out there thinking, I'm not going to use a telephone line, dial up, but what if we could make that internet run, that bulletin board run over the internet? And that is exactly what happened. They built the internet server software, for want of a better term, run it over common internet protocols such as Telnet and SSH, the Secure Shell. And you can download free software such as SyncTERM or Netrunner and connect, dial in, but connect to these bulletin boards, which are newly created. They've been around for 5 years or less, maybe some of them as old as 10 years, but ultimately, these are new experiences in a world that we know around the internet, but they kind of have the exact same feel as the old bulletin boards of the 90s and some of them the 80s. You can go on, you can download files, and you can go into forums and chat about things in the forums. But then they also have, in some cases, extra new functionality, which builds on the fact that they're on a modern internet, so that they have like things like interrelated BBS connections, so you can chat with other people across all of the bulletin boards, and use the internet like APIs, for example, to get information on things that people never could before. So whether that's stocks and share information, whether that's the news of today, whether that's the weather, I don't know, but a lot of these things have been built with the same look and feel of the bulletin board that was back in there in the old days, without all the corporate overhead of Facebook and X and whatever. So I think that's a wonderful world to be in, and we're really, everybody who remembers the old days of the internet and the BBS is going, yes, this is awesome. We are building this for ourselves, by ourselves, and so that's where we are. And the whole point of building that or making that documentary series back to the BBS was like, hey, this thing exists now. Come along and join us. The more, the merrier. And that's kind of what that was all about.
But on the other hand, as a security professional, back in the DOS days and back in the early BBS days, the worst thing that could happen was maybe somebody breaking out of a door program on your BBS and maybe wreaking havoc and having to restore from floppies or something. Today, they might, break out of the door and maybe escalate, get out into the VM or whatever, maybe even launch an attack from your machine, which you're probably paying hosting on, if not hosting it yourself. What principles from the BBS era need to be updated for the internet, and what principles of, today's internet and, as a security professional, do you think need to also take into account what we used to have to take into account back then in the old BBS days?
So the first question about breaking out of doors and so forth. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that possibly could happen and will happen and has probably happened. Just because I haven't heard about it doesn't mean that it won't happen. Um, I think the things that a lot of sysops do, the ones who are more tech savvy in terms of security, especially, is that they run their instances of their bulletin boards in containers. So even if you manage to break out into the container, there is a limited set of damage that you could do. It's still pretty unfortunate, and that really depends on how you connect your containers together. So, for example, my one, you've got a container with all of the file share stuff, and then you have the separate container with the bulletin board service itself. So if you get out and somehow get out off the main door or the main application itself, the main bulletin board server itself somehow, then theoretically what would happen is you would be out into the Linux container itself, and yes, you could wreak havoc on that bulletin board, which would be a very sad thing to do, because by and large, the people who are long, as I said, have a very close mentality to yourself. They're, really annoyed with the internet and really want to have a good time. And that mentality is, I have thousands of users on my bulletin board, for example, and every one of them is kind of required to write a welcome email to say who they are, what they're doing. And almost every single one of them is like, hey, this is amazing, back on the bulletin board, this is great, I'm here for the good times. That is thoroughly the message that I get from every single person that joins in. So I feel like it would be a very unlikely event just because of the mentality of the people. But going back to what you're saying, yes, build your infrastructure securely, build it with the aspect of least privilege, and in it from a security perspective. And so that's why I have the kind of two separate containers, the ones for all the stuff that if they were able to delete those, then I do have a backup of it, but it's a growing file system. At one point, I think it would be uneconomical for me to back everything up. So I've got the two containers, and one cannot simply traverse from the BBS one to the other or the other way around, right? So yeah, use all the appropriate permission sets and containerization, which is all modern to the modern day computing, I would say. When Microsoft Windows itself is not an operating system that I would choose to use. Just so again, containerization under Windows is also a bit harder. So there's just other levels. So if you're okay or fairly savvy with Linux, then I would just use Linux because there's no extra cost involved either. There's so many reasons that you would probably want to use Linux, and using like the common software for bulletin boards, the common software, server software, like Mystic, for example, or SyncTERM, or Synchronet, sorry. All of these softwares are actually got Windows and they've got Linux releases. And doing the configuration under Linux and Windows is exactly the same anyway. So your level of knowledge about the operating system underlying is not really that significantly different in any case. So I think that was the answer to your first question. And your second question, sorry, was again?
And what other security practices carry over from your BBS days onto your modern work?
Uh, yeah, I think the configuration of a bulletin board back then, I mean, I'm struggling to remember really all the things that you would configure in your bulletin board. But I feel like things like permissions escalation and that sort of stuff is perhaps something that you would need to make sure was configured properly. So for example, when a new user logs into my bulletin board, and I'm pretty sure this is very similar for most bulletin board users, when they log in, they get a very limited configuration of security, right? They only get a level 10, right? And then if I look at what that user has gone and done on the bulletin board, they may be elevated to a 20. So they get extra permissions to view certain news groups or certain file areas or run certain functionality, right? So there's a level of trust that you can build up with the user, but they don't get the whole functionality of the system on their first login, right? They have to be seen as a valid user. So they might drop me a message. Back in the old days of the dial-up BBS, there used to be a lot more nefarious users, right? And there were bulletin boards that were specifically designed to, hacking, and they were called HPAV boards, which meant hacking, freaking, anarchy, viruses, and sometimes you'd have HPAV-C, and the C stood for cracking. So they would crack software that was kind of copyright protected and share it on bulletin boards. These are really exciting times, but they also came with a bunch of pretty scary, dodgy people sometimes that would do all sorts of untold carnage just because they could. So a lot of the things that you had to do on those bulletin boards was like once you wanted a connection to that bulletin board, you would sign up, but then you wouldn't get access to the bulletin board. You either had to get a call back from the sysop, like a voice call to suss you out, or you had to be trusted by a member affiliation or a fill before you could even get a look in at calling up the BBS. So back in the old days, there were certain different protection methodologies that haven't followed into the bulletin board world of today. And it's probably a good thing because they were real hassles, but that's kind of how it used to be. So yeah, these days it's all about setting the appropriate permissions to log into doors to check particular news groups or systems inside your
Now,
board.
all of what you've mentioned so far is server side. If someone puts like a DOS machine or any other vintage machine on a modern network using either the tools of back then, if they had access to TCP/IP, or more modern tools, or using things like Wi-Fi 232, telnetting to BBSes, other bridges between modern technology and vintage tech, what threat models should they adopt? What good enough controls do you recommend, like having your own VLAN, read-only shares, authenticated proxies, and so on?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, look, if you're just a home user, I think, and again, like right, so I work in cybersecurity. My background's actually got my own company logo on it, which I forgot to take off before this call.
It's okay.
But ultimately, I think I would say to any business, right, this we're potentially running over insecure protocols here, especially if we're not using SSH, right? We're using Telnet. And if you've got a device which is, 40 years old and somehow you've managed to get it on the internet via methods, Alex, that you've mentioned there, which are fantastic technologies, by the way. So I've got a PC over in the corner, which is a 5160 IBM XT, and I've got it connecting via Telnet. I won't dwell on that for a moment, but what I will say is if you're using really old tech and really old software, and somehow you've cobbled it onto the internet, there is an inherent risk of it being, using networks which, don't have all of the protections of modern day systems and risks associated with that. What I will say is there's two parts to that. One of them is the reality of that exposing a risk on your home network. Because let's face it, most of these people are not going to be corporate users in an office. They're going to be people who are in the house, like me, having fun playing, right? The chances of you actually getting in trouble as a result of these insecure protocols is going to be very low, just because the reason is the obscurity of the technology, right? You're using very, very old technology, which hackers are really not, perhaps not even knowledgeable in 2025 of, right? And even if they are, the interest level to them is very low because their targets are much more, financially motivated than these days in any case. Back in the day, that wasn't so much the case. They would go after anything because they could, and it would be like, haha, look at what I've done. But that's the reality. What I would say is absolutely don't do that. Protect as much as you can because you don't know what is out there. The internet is a bad place with bad actors, right? So I would be negligent of me to say don't protect yourself, even though the risk level is still low, right? So you made a number of comments about the sort of ways that you can protect yourself. So if you're using something like the Wi-Fi 232, for example, you're connecting over the wireless internet or the wireless home gateway, for example. In a house, even if you weren't using old tech, I would still recommend you create two networks. And so from a Wi-Fi perspective, you would create two Wi-Fi access point SSIDs. So one you would call the Wild West or the home network that's untrusted, guest network, whatever you want to call it, right? And the other one is your more trusted network. So those are the names of your SSIDs. So you get two SSIDs. You could have as many as you want. And then in the sort of lower networking layer below that, if your home network supports it, some don't even now, which is crazy, but still true, you create VLANs, so virtual local area networks. So that's kind of like you would have a VLAN number tagged associated to one of those Wi-Fi SSIDs and another number associated to the other one. So obviously 0 or 1 or whatever that number may be for the trusted-ish access point, the SSID, sorry, and another number associated with that. Now, basically, what that means is that the traffic going down the Wild West, the untrusted, that is like you can just put everything that you don't want. But the good point is that it separates that traffic from the other. So logically and physically, at both layers, the traffic never meets other than right at that Wi-Fi AP, but they can't cross-pollinate, which is the main thing. So you can have all that untrusted traffic and go um, as long as I'm not worried about that traffic being untrusted. The reality is that they will never meet in that method, so that you can basically say if that device gets mauled, it's not going to maul the rest of the traffic in my network. So all those devices that are really important to me, those ones are safe. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of the same advice that you see a lot of times for things like IoT or entertainment devices such as smart TVs and so on. If you'd rather, and it's a good, it's a good practice security wise, have the traffic separated, there are certainly ways to do so. Unfortunately, not all routers support that. But usually people who are into retro stuff might have either something like DDWRT or they'll have like a mini PC with two networking ports or something like that where you can maybe run something that is more flexible in that regard. That being said, there are some devices out there that do support like separate guest networks with a different VLAN and so on. If you can, it's definitely worth taking equally or even more care of your devices, especially your retro devices, which barely have internet connectivity as it is because it's
Mm.
put together by people who want to connect them. And security is not something that they're neglecting. It's just not as priority as just getting them on the internet.
It's actually really hard to get the secure protocols on top of these things. So a lot of the time when you see BBSes, they'll offer SSH connections, which are encrypted both ends, right? The SSH protocol version 2, whereas most BBSes will offer two types of connection. Telnet, which is an insecure connection, basically it's unencrypted. It's as old as time. It's been around since the 70s. Um, and they'll also offer SSH. The reason that they do this is because if you've got a modern device, modern PC or Mac or whatever Linux box, those will be able to connect over SSH, whereas your old retro machines, they don't have the computing power to encrypt that traffic via SSH, so they fall back to Telnet. Now, to be honest with you, most of the time when you're on a bulletin board system, you're not going to be talking about super private stuff. So, nah, it probably doesn't matter. I think you mentioned there, Alex, IoT devices. I think the critical distinction between IoT devices and why you absolutely should use IoT devices on a VLAN, a separate VLAN, and if it's wireless, then a separate wireless AP is SSID. I don't know why I keep saying that, sorry. But you really should. And the critical distinction, I guess, between the old DOS-based or whatever retro devices is, generally speaking, they don't have open ports on them. So they're not listening for traffic coming in from the internet. They're only pushing traffic out. Unfortunately, with IoT devices, they're written or made in very insecure ways, even in 2025, which is just diabolical. And a lot of them have ports open to the internet, or they open ports in a funny way. And the problem with that is these devices are rarely patched, rarely kept up to date, have quite a lot of security vulnerabilities because of that over time. And that means that hackers can really penetrate your connection into the network. And of course, if they're in there's a bunch of VLANs that nothing that can really be, you don't mind if it gets hacked, really that big a deal. But if they're also in the same VLAN or the same connection as all the other devices which you do care about, that's where the biggest problem lies, right? So if you've got IoT devices, whether that's washing machines, televisions, anything that's
Security
really not
cameras.
supposed to, get those separated out. It's my absolute advice. It's really important.
Yeah, my biggest worry right now is a lot of ISPs are just handing out /64s and people are just connecting them to their router and have no idea that it's actually listening. Of course, it's going to take you forever to scan the IPv6 internet, but you never know. So you really have to be careful. Speaking of being careful, one of the great things about nowadays is that we have access to places like, you know, PC like printed circuit board manufacturers, of which there's one that's really famous and pretty much sponsors every retro YouTuber
Sponsor
out.
my channel.
Excellent. And then let's talk
Yeah.
about them. There's PCBWay, there's so many others. But there's also a lot of things like cloned cards that are being sold as the originals or repro ROMs, counterfeit chips. There's a lot of I've seen a lot of YouTubers that are, making a repair or whatever, and they buy like 5 or 6 chips, and 3 or 4 are counterfeit or rebadged or just broken. What practical checks would you tell hobbyists that's starting to they should run to avoid getting compromised or subpart parts? Any stories where your infosec mindset saved you some grief?
Uh, yeah, I mean that is a sad reality. There are a dime a dozen. So when you're on eBay, these are on eBay, but they're also on prolifically on things like Temu and AliExpress. And the draw is for these makers to get replacement chips, for example, the ICs, and they go, well, I need my bad RAM is on the fat, so I need a new IC. So a lot of the time you'll get a replacement from one of these places because you can get a bag of them for next to nothing. And unfortunately, you get what you pay for in many cases. But sometimes you're paying way over the odds, especially on eBay and so forth. And again, these characters can be out there as well. You do have a little bit more buyer protection, though, I think, on eBay. So I think it's a lot of the case, unfortunately, is buyer beware. And you kind of get what you pay for in a lot of cases. But when you purchase these ICs, particularly, a lot of the time they've gone to the effort of either cutting out the thin layer where the text has been printed on with the original IC. So the original IC could be anything, and they've just kind of covered over that with paint or whatever, and then copied on somehow with the replacement paint, replacement text of the brand of IC that you want. A quick bit of nail polish remover or whatever can reveal the text that was underneath, or at least show that it's the original text has been scraped off. So yeah, again, it's really buyer beware. Um, the super cheap ones, they're not going to go and put a bit of nail polish remover over it for you to just check. But people on eBay, I guess you could question them and say, hey, could you just try and see if you've been given a dodgy chip yourself? Could you put a bit of nail polish remover on top and see if anything changes? Or could you validate for me if you could put it in an IC reader if you've got one, and just show me what you come back with, or if they're ROMs, that is, do ROM dumps, all that sort of stuff. But it is tricky. I mean, I have bought stuff off eBay before, only to receive it, and it's dead. So I don't. Other than that, there's not an awful lot of advice that I can give makers out there to definitely say that they've got a good piece of equipment. Unfortunately, I don't know if you've got any other salient piece of advice yourself.
Definitely, my biggest advice, if anyone asks, is to follow creators like you, like so many others that do this very often, and then ask. A lot of the times, if you're a patron, you can directly ask the creators for advice, and usually that includes, hey, I bought this part from this reputable vendor, or before buying this, this is what I did, or this is how I tested it, or this is the tool that I used to test if I got a dud, and so on. So definitely just,
Yeah.
follow the advice of people who do this a lot more often than you do. I think you can't go
Yeah.
wrong with that.
So yeah, I mean, I've got things like EEPROM readers and so forth. So I just plug it in first, do a dump of it, and if it comes back as just all FF or something like that,
Hmm.
I've got a dud. And obviously there are reputable vendors out there. like Mouser and so forth, you'll pay 4 times the price, but you're guaranteed that every one of those chips is good, and you can return them if you don't. And of course, there's those uh, printed circuit board manufacturers. They if you're buying one of those, just the boards themselves, not the chips, they have guarantees on them. So you build it badly, it's up to you. But if you get it made properly for you, then it will be guaranteed from defects. You can return it. So
Yeah,
yeah, it really depends.
I've had, for example, great experiences with the creators of FujiNet, for example. I made a mistake once and I wrote them, hey, by the way, I'm also wanting to buy another FujiNet for this other device and so on. I made this mistake with this one. I might need something else or whatever. And they were really kind. They sent me the part that I had installed or whatever, for no charge. And I think
Yeah.
that kind of attests to the kind of attitude that you get from the community. Everybody's out there trying to help each other
Yeah.
out.
That's
Speaking
kind
of,
of
Mhm.
Sorry. Well, I'll just quickly add to that with the fact that it kind of harks back to the people that are on the BBSes these days. But yes, we have a wonderful, thriving maker community and FujiNet. There's lots of examples out there like FujiNet of devices that are being made by small groups of people or just individuals, but they really care about what they're doing. But a lot of them are doing it in their own spare time. But even then, they are doing it because they love this stuff, right? Look at Perifractic recently. Hopefully everything goes well with him. But Perifractic has a YouTube channel, which is now incredibly popular. But basically, he is in the midst right now of purchasing the Commodore brand so that he and the bunch of people that he's accrued together, they're putting together a revival of Commodore. And what they do with that is hopefully will be for the greater good of people all over, millions of people all over the world that loved Commodore. And I know that's about passion and it's not about money making. So again, there's most people in this community. We're in it for that, and there's so many forums, VC Fed, all the rest of the forums out there, Vogons, for example. They're great because we're all interested in helping out. There's not one person on there that's kind of not doing that. Everybody's helping out, which is really fantastic.
Yeah, and I hope it's an example for the rest of the community. I mean, we need something like that to happen maybe for Atari or Sinclair or Radio Shack and so many other brands that were part of our lives during the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s as well. Speaking of the people that were part of that scene at the time, which figures in the retro world most influenced your approach? And if you could speak to one retro tech icon that's no longer with us, who would it be and what would you ask?
Do you know, I, I think I haven't actually thought of that question before, which is wild because I I probably should have. In fact, no, actually there is one, but there's so many, I think, which is the problem because I'd love to speak to Clive Sinclair and what his motivations were for the ZX Spectrum and all of Sinclair, to be honest with you. He was really interested in making the cheapest, right? But why was he making the cheapest? Was it because he wanted computers in every room? I'd love to speak with Steve Wozniak and find out if he really hated Steve Jobs, or whether he loved Steve Jobs, or I'd love to speak to Steve Jobs himself. Find out many things about the interesting guy who is also very hard and horrible to people. I would love to speak to so many people, but I think the one who I'd like to speak to the most was probably somebody who I made a short documentary on, and
Let me
that's Gary
guess.
Kildall.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Gary
that.
Kildall, yeah. And I think Gary Kildall was kind of special to me because he created the operating system, the first real operating system of the microcomputer age. And if you think about a microcomputer, right? So the computers that we have today in the house, you need an operating system to do anything with it. And so if it wasn't for him, somebody else would have come along and done what did what he did, but that would have been a year away or something like that. So he came along, and he came along at the right time. But he was from a background that had nothing to do with computers, really. He just got into it kind of because, he was at Naval Academy. He was teaching. He was a professor, I think. And not only was he very clever in software and hardware, but he was also a really nice guy by the accounts of many, many people. And he had a very sad life in the end. But, he was a really, really nice guy. And he wasn't a businessman, clearly. And because of that, that's why he ultimately lost out. But I'd love to hear his story. I'm pretty sure I have heard his story because I've heard the story from his closest friend. But his closest friend is perhaps going to be a little bit biased. But, I've heard it from him. And I think it's there was somebody who had the opportunity to be Bill Gates and didn't for a few reasons. Perhaps because Bill Gates and IBM were in, a secret kind of cohort anyway. But I'd love to meet the guy and shake his hand and say, hey, look, you were the guy who inspired millions and millions of people because you were the person that took computing home and built an operating system that interfaced disks, the storage, the screen, the keyboards, and when in a time when nobody else had done that. Sure, they'd done that on the big computers, the IBM mainframes and the mini computers from Digital, but he was the first that went, hey, these are really, really powerless computers. They had very, very low memory, very, very low capacity in very many ways. And he was the guy that said, look, let's just make an operating system for this and pull it all together. And so without him, the home computing era of 1977, which is when the computing triad, right? We had the Commodore TRS-80, we had the TI-99 from Texas Instruments, and we also had the Apple II, which is the one that was remembered mostly. If it wasn't for the initial work that was started in 1974 by Gary Kildall and all those sort of S100 bus systems before that, then those systems wouldn't really have had that start. So it would have been 1980 or whatever before those systems were around, because all those initial concepts were taken by others and copied by him by that. And MS-DOS, if you look at it, is a carbon copy of CP/M in many, many respects. The whole abstraction of things through APIs. APIs is what we use to this very day. APIs was a concept that he developed. The whole BIOS concept, the basic input-output system, was a concept that, again, he developed. So there's many firsts from that guy, and he just kind of went, oh, here's something I wrote earlier. It's a very modest, very likable guy. So I'd love to speak to him, I think.
Yeah, he would have been a kinder, gentler version of what Bill Gates ultimately became. That being said, you have interviewed a lot of really important people in the industry, like Ken Williams and Kevin Driscoll, if I recall correctly. What's one insight from these conversations that still informs how you see today's platforms and today's communities?
Uh, that informs today's communities. I think when interviewing people who were influential in the evolution of computing, um, they did things out of passion, out of small things. You mentioned Ken Williams. Well, Ken Williams, for those of you who are listening who don't know who Ken Williams was or is, sorry, Ken was a computer programmer. Can't remember for whom, but he was a computer programmer and he loved to write Fortran compilers. And he did that remotely over a teletype back to his workplace. So that was an early example of remote working. And so he was quite happy doing this. And then his wife, Roberta Williams, had played this thing on this teletype or this, I think it was a console actually by that time, and it was called Colossal Cave, an adventure game, and it was all text. But she was fascinated by this. She loved it, and she said, "Hey, Ken, could you do something like this?" And Ken sort of shrugged and went, I guess so. And she said, but also, could it have graphics like on the screens? Could you make it go and show up a picture of a haunted house or something like that? So therefore, what happened is they decided that they were having much more fun making these computer games than he was writing Fortran compilers for his workplace. And then he quit that, and then they made a company called Sierra, which went on till the early noughties and made some massive smash hit games and really set the industry. So I think the pioneers of those days were pioneers. They made things that nobody else had made, right? Ken and Roberta, there was nobody like that at the time. Atari was just being conceived, right? They were making games like Pong and so forth in the arcades. Um, but these were pioneers. These were people who had not, there was nothing like it before. And so I think that if we look at today's pioneers, they are iterating over things that have been set by precedents of the past. These modern day games, for example, they all should be thankful to people like Ken and Roberta for bringing these technologies around. So my kind of thought about all of this stuff is that they are copying things of old. They are iterations, which is logical, and you of course you would do, you'd copy them. But you know, I'm scratching my head, going, where's the innovation of the next thing? Where's the next real change? And of course, today I think the next real massive shift is in AI. I think that's the truly new thing out there that we've had a few devices, a few hardware devices. We've got the mobile phone. We've had tablets, but I guess tablets are kind of not going that way. So there's only a few things that have really come along in the last sort of 40 years that have been true paradigm shifts. And yeah, if you think about it, it's the mobile phone and I guess the graphical user interface was another shift, but that was kind of in the 80s as well. So it's the internet and it's the mobile phone, and there's a few probably other things out there. But now it's AI. If we think about those logical shift changes, those are the kind of three things that have happened that could not hark back to those earlier days in a massive way. They're lockstep changes that technology is influenced, but really they're massively changing.
On this side of the Atlantic or the Pacific, depending on which side you are of the planet itself, we had shows, at least I remember in my childhood, here in Panama, we had a TV channel that was Armed Forces Radio and Television, which was run by the U.S. military while they were here in, managing the Panama Canal until its turnover in 1999. And one of the shows that I used to watch there was called The Computer Chronicles, where Gary Kildall was a major fixture there for a very long time. On your end of things, there was, I think, something called the computer program on BBC
Mm,
as well.
yeah,
What
yeah.
other media shaped your vision of computers and maybe inspired you to maybe work with the technologies and sometimes and at some point in the future even speak to some of these people that were once featured on these shows in that regard?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that uh, the computer show was really quite early. For me, I was pretty much very young. Um, I would have been, yeah, still very young kid. And so by the time I got my first PC XT, there wasn't any TV in the UK about the internet, which was really sorry, not the internet, but just in general
Computers.
computing. So what happened in the UK is we had the government at the time recognized that we were way behind the curve from other competing countries right in the West, and they needed to do something about that, and that was both for children, but also in the working age predominantly. So they felt like they wanted to do something for both, and so that the computer show was a kind of thing that they used to um, get education into schools, but also into the workplace. And what they did was an amazing thing, I think, which was eventually together with the British Broadcasting Corporation, which is a government entity, not for profit, so they say. But they worked together. So they had programming on the BBC television. They released a significantly discounted computer through Acorn that won the bid against Clive Sinclair, and they made the BBC microcomputer. Now, we look back at the BBC, especially in the UK, with a lot of fond affection because you grew up with the BBC in schools, but you also had there an extremely well produced computer. I mean, a lot of the things, the design principles that went into that, they were just phenomenal. They were really, really well made. And if you look at how the BBC stacks up with, say, the Apple II, which is probably its closest sort of sibling in terms of computing, they both ran on a 6502 microprocessor, for example. It was just streets ahead. It took all of the things that made the Apple II great and just doubled them or tripled them in some cases. I mean, it introduced a thing called Econet, for example, which gave you networking across the classroom or the workplace. It included awesome video modes, the video modes that gave way to teletext, which was, on the TV you could go through pages of information. It used, had 32 or later in the master 128K of RAM. There was a lot of things that when it came out in 1981 were significant leaps of computing power or just ease of use, and they common and made disk drives commonplace. There was a whole lot of things. So I really think that the BBC was influential in the UK and was a definite marked step at the time. And I feel it's quite sad that we're not making things like the BBC anymore. And that's kind of true across the world. Like, why aren't we investing at the grassroots in computing for children? Because it was so interesting for all of us, like all the kids, even the ones who didn't really do computing. All the kids were like, "Oh, can we go on the computer? Can we go on the?" Whether that was just playing Granny's Garden, you were learning it, but subliminally almost. But then there was other kids like me who were like, "What's this logo thing?" And the logo was this little, glass ball or something like that, and it had a pen in it, and it could physically move about the floor and draw pictures, and you could get it to do all sorts. So you're learning programming, but by fun. And so programming, like that was just, you're not learning it in the same way these days. I feel like, kids are learning Python, which is a lot harder than Basic or a Logo or something like that. So yeah, I think that's something that we're not getting enough of these days. Grassroots programming for kids would be I'd love to see more of, kind of back to the 80s, simplistic programming, simplistic devices for kids that are not internet connected. Let's stay away from all that noise. Let's stay away from all that badness. There's a lot of nasty stuff and lots of nasty people out there. So let's stay away from that. Let's get people interested, because kids are naturally curious. Kids love to play with things. And I think that was the beauty of the BBC. And I was like, they told me I was a computer whiz at school when I was in primary school, but I wasn't. I was just curious. I just loved to play things and break them. And I think a lot of kids are too. They're naturally inquisitive. But going back on your question, I think the TV programming in the UK, I don't think by the time I got to that certain age, I think that there was very little of it. We had programs like Tomorrow's World that showed off new innovations in technology, but nothing solid. What I would say is that I was buying a lot of computer-based magazines at the time. So I was buying Your Sinclair, for example, which was, you'd get in there, you'd get readouts of basic programs, and it was frustrating as all hell with those rubber keys on the ZX Spectrum. Um, but you could, if you had the patience, and as a kid you got spare time on your hands, you would type in all these basic games and just watch every week as you'd buy the next version of the or next every month, or I can't remember how often they came out, but you'd buy the magazine and then you get the next part of the code and then the next part. And as long as they hadn't printed an error, which they often did, I'm afraid, that was amazing fun because you could see something come together. They would often explain the code as well. And once all of that started to come together in your head, you could really enjoy seeing a creation of what, and then that gave you more inquisitiveness, more drive to write your own software. I was never really any good at it, but it was always something I came back to in later life.
I totally get it. I used to have the Latin American version of the ZX81, so it was even worse trying to type in
Oh,
those
goodness, yeah.
programs. And I remember that even in the original books that came with it, occasionally you'd get a typo and you'd have to try to find out and troubleshoot what the program was supposed to do and sometimes even guess. So I
I think
totally
that
get
must
that.
have been like part of the thing they did deliberately almost because it would teach you about it. Because honestly, it happened so often, and they must have just done list and run, and surely the program either worked or it didn't. So they must have known it broke.
Now, that being said, you've experimented with multiplexing MTCP or Quick Basic and so on. What modern developer practices make sense when you're targeting 8 and 16-bit environments?
Yeah, okay, that's a cool question. Before I answer that, I will just the reason I made those videos about specifically that quick basic one is
Mhm.
because that is about the joy of computing, right? So whether you did ZX Basic or BBC Basic, by the way, BBC Basic is probably the best basic. But if you're writing code back then, um, and then you go to write code now, whether you're writing it in Python or C or whatever the modern language is. If you go back to Quick Basic or Basic, whatever flavor of it, I think it's a heck of a lot of fun. And there was something about Quick Basic or even Q Basic, the free version that came with DOS, that is just so pick upable, and it brings this feeling of joy. And I think if you think about computers today, whether you're firing up Python or anything new, or even just the applications on your computer, nothing to do with programming, I think there's much less joy in it. And I think that was something about the time. It's not just nostalgia. It's about, using a computer not as a tool. And we go to work today and we use a computer for a tool to get an outcome done. We would pick up QBasic or whatever, um, just just to have fun, to see what it could do. And it was built into the operating system or the ROMs of the system. And it was just there. So there was no pressure about it. It wasn't there to drive an outcome. It was simply there. And you could use it or you couldn't use it. It was up to you. And I think that was a thing that was very different about today. The computer was seen as something, to experiment with, to have fun with, and it's not like that today. It's a tool to get a job done. It's a boring kind of thing. So anyway, to answer your question about um, developing, some part of it, going back to that, well, saying about that joy, some part of it, you want to just develop on the real hardware because of that joy factor. But the reality of it is that it can be quite laborious and tedious as well, especially as you're kind of limited by an 80 by 25 column screen, or even worse, if you're on a Commodore or something like that, and you've got, pardon me, a 40 column display, it can be pretty trying. So the reality as well, and of course, if you're compiling something, so if you're compiling in C or Pascal even, you have to wait for your computer's processor, which could be pretty slow, to go through all of those lines of code and then build it and then make it and so forth. And then you'll find an error and then you go back to square one. And it's pretty tedious, right? So if you've got the grunt of a massively, massively more powerful computer from modern times, then of course you might want to take the opportunity to build on that computer and then copy it across to an old computer, which is exactly what I do in many cases. So I just started writing a piece of software, and this is all for fun, right? So I've got a 7-year-old, and she, loves little games that, she's got a laptop with all DOS games on her that I gave her. And she loves it, and they've all got math games on them and stuff like that. And she has a great time with it. And I thought, well, we could develop ones for her, just to have fun. And she loves unicorns and she loves other things, right? So I thought, well, we could adapt these games to do that. And I thought, well, why don't I write them in my modern PC, but use something like what have I got? I've got OpenWatcom, which is the Linux binary of that. So you can write the code in any modern IDE you want. So if you use VS Code, write it in VS Code. If you want to just write it in a plain text editor like me in Vim, go for gold, and then you compile it, make sure it all works. Very quick turnaround process. And once you build that target exe for either 16-bit real mode or 32-bit if you've got the 386 in protected mode. So you could use OpenWatcom for that. You could also use the DJGPP compiler, which is the open source DOS version or the open source. It's like the C++ compiler for Linux, but you can build DOS compiled. And so there's other versions of this that it doesn't just have to be DOS, but obviously I do a lot of stuff in DOS. And so you can use that. What I've also found now is in the advent of AI, love it or hate it, you can tell it, because there's that much stuff out there. You can say, hey, write me a DOS game, regardless of whether you want to write it in C. You can tell it what you want. You can have Quick Basic, C, whatever. The languages that is known more on the internet, mostly like things like C and C++. You can say, write me a game that does this, that, and the next thing, but also make sure it's written for DOS in OpenWatcom compiler or whatever, and it pops out the source code, and there you go. You compile it, take it to the old machine, and it's just amazing. And you can try the outcome of that first in things like DOSBox. So you can see, oh, well, it's not written me a game that I quite like yet. It needs a bit of refinement. So you go back into whatever you're using, the AI agent, go back and say, well, I like this, but can you change that? And then it will give you the source code, and then you go off compile it. But the iteration is so fast now, it's just amazing. And if I just want a quick thing for a 7-year-old and I don't want to labor over it for weeks or days, which I really don't have the time because I run my own business, that sort of stuff is really cool. And it's very, very fun. And you can, of course, tweak the code for you, to whatever you want it to do. And it's just great to see the results. So I've enjoyed that. So at the moment, the workflow, if I'm just doing something really quick like that and I'm writing for DOS, I'm not really worried about security because it's not going on the internet at all. I'm literally just saying, hey, I downloaded something called Gemini CLI, so which is a command line interface for Gemini, which is Google's AI. So it runs the pro version of Gemini. And, I told it exactly what I want it to do, and it goes off and does it. And then it gives me the source code. Then I compile it, and then, I run it in DOSBox just to make sure it's right. And then I copy it across via Wi-Fi to my machine over in the corner. That's super.
Which is conceptually not too far from how it was done in the 70s and 80s, where they would write the code and compile it in VAXs or mainframes and then bring it over serial lines and cross your fingers and hit run and hope for the best.
That's absolutely correct. And I kind of sometimes I forget about that. But then some other times I remember that that's what it was, because the development environments needed to be pretty fast. They didn't want to be waiting for hours and hours on compiles. They wanted to get it done quickly, have the power of a nice editor, for example, as well, and then cross-compile it and send it over. And in fact, that's what the developers in id Software were doing when they made Doom as well. I think they were using a Next station, so a Unix workstation, very powerful. Was it powerful? It was more powerful than probably the PC they were sitting working on. So it could potentially, and they probably had it as a preferred platform. I don't know, but in any case, they were writing their code on a Motorola-based system, definitely not an Intel-based system, and then they were compiling the code on that and then sending it over to their DOS system. So that was their preferred workflow. So that workflow is still something which is very much alive today, regardless of whether you're writing for old DOS systems or whether you're writing for an ARM chip and you're writing it for an Intel or vice versa.
Now, you're using both your existing knowledge of systems built at the time, plus things like artificial intelligence to kind of complement and create projects that are uh, still within your wheelhouse. Which projects do you think feel just outside your wheelhouse where you'd love to maybe co-create with other retro enthusiasts?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I think my hardware tinkering capabilities are just, they're frustrating for me because they're not good enough, and I would love to have a better electrical engineering knowledge. But the reality of my life is that, I'm super busy running a business. I barely have enough time to make YouTube videos, which I'd love to do more of, but just simply don't have the time. So I think what I would do is if I was retired and had all the free time in the world, I would get in touch with people like the folks at Fujinet, for example. And I think perhaps Fujinet, they're kind of off and away themselves because but somebody like Fujinet, because what they have is a fairly unique capability there to write the software and the hardware, and that is super rare. They might be really good hardware people, but not so good software people. But what I've seen, especially recently, is that they have been able to make software that does things at quite a quick iterative rate. So they're building out, the guys at Fujinet, for example, are building out hardware for the PC, and I've seen them testing it on the PC Junior. So the original Fujinet was supposed to be for the Atari, as you know, by the sounds of Alex. And they had sort of a subset of software made for the Atari, and then they started thinking about other platforms, and now they're just starting to write the software for the hardware and the software for the PC, and this is the 8-bit PCs, the PC Junior, the early IBM PCs, and so forth. And they have some videos on their YouTube channel about the iterations of the software that they're doing and their capability to write the software for the PC, but other platforms as well, not just the PC. Doing this and in so many different environments, they're writing this super quickly. Their iteration is incredible. I think if I had that capability to either work with people like that or to do it myself, it would be amazing, because what they're doing is they're basically saying, hey, we've got a printed circuit board here. We're going to make all of this work somehow with either the bus. I think that their intent is to make it work over the ISA 8-bit bus, but at the moment I think it works through parallel port. But effectively make that hardware from nothing, effectively, that will make the printed circuit board, we'll use these chips, we'll combine it all together, we'll make the hardware to do this. And then make the software to talk over interrupts, DMA, to do all of the control stuff. And they're doing it at such an abstract level. They're basically saying, hey, we don't even need the operating system to load. We'll jump start this at the BIOS call that says seek for this. And so they're able to write, basically they must be writing at assembly level, but perhaps through C, but they're writing at the hardware interrupt level to say, hey, rather than going to drive A, go to drive A, which is actually a Wi-Fi connection to somewhere else on the internet, and then download or stream this executable which is a game or something like that, and it will put it in local memory and then run that. And so you can think of the growth of the applications that can be achieved by doing this. It's only set by the imagination. And so never before have we been, I say never before, we have been able to do this stuff. There was a platform in the 80s that came out in Canada, which was, God, what was it called now? There's been a few videos because there was basically a dumpster of them that came out. It was a four-letter word, and I can't remember what it was now. Little black box, basically a TV set-top box. It was ingenious because it would stream applications over the cable, over cable TV, basically. So there was this one network in Canada that was making this thing just way, way, way ahead of its time. You could buy stuff over, its shopping channel, and you could play games and you could get news and stuff like this. This is before the internet. But the reality is they're now making things like Fujinet and keep on making devices like this that have a whole ecosystem of software and hardware. And I'd love to get into something like that because, the BBS is an example of where we are augmenting really old technology with really new technology of the internet and making applications that extend the capability in a really positive, fun way. And, that's, something I really love.
Yeah, one project that I would love to, that I would love for it to continue expanding, for example, is both PicoMem and PicoGus. I would love to have like a combined card that would do both. It would probably require two RP 2040s because, it's barely, being able to do everything as it is. My first PC was a Tandy 1000, which I got in 1987, and I have a Tandy 1000 that I'm working on, and it only has three slots, and one of them has like DMA and memory and whatever, and it's different enough from the 5150 that not everything will work directly on it as it is, especially if it has to do with hardware. So I would love to have something like a PicoGust slash PicoMem built for it just because, but that's just me. But yeah,
Yeah, I think the Pico Gus and the Pico Mem again is another great example of extending the capabilities of those early PCs and so forth. And you're absolutely right. I think, yeah, I mean the power of it's getting to the very edge of the power capability of the Pi Zero, which it uses. So you probably have to somehow shoehorn two together or something like that, or maybe go up to a Raspberry Pi, where we at five now, to make that whole thing happen. But you're absolutely right. I mean, again, there's another perfect example of where Freddie V is just basically working on his own. I think, which is wild. It would be great to have a collaborative approach, but he's working on his own, putting so much time into this one board that has new technology on it all the time. But it started out as a sound card, right? Was it started out as a like an AdLib or CMS or something like that. But it started out just as that, and then it got memory expansion, so you could add a EMS memory onto the PC up to 2 megs, I think it was at the time, and it was very slow. But then it got better recently, where I think it's through DMA, it's gotten better. The speed of that introduced quite a lot of wait states, and now that's fixed apparently. And then also did storage, and then USB hub, and all these different things. It just added and added and added all over iterations. Again, that's another perfect example there, Alex, of real extensibility for you thought the lifetime and the usefulness of this old hardware was kind of that's it, it will only do this, and that has totally been proven wrong, not just for the old PCs, but for all the platforms that you can think of. There's new things coming out all the time for the BBC. There's something similar to the Pico the Pico Mem for the BBC, which makes it fly. I mean, it can do ridiculously interesting things now. The Amstrad CPCs, the ZX Spectrums, all of the platforms that really meant something. The Amigas, the Commodore 64. I mean, that's got such a vibrant ecosystem. I don't even know where to begin with that one. But everything is growing. And then you've also got this era of the FPGAs now, which, yeah, I'm personally not that fond of because it kind of like feels to me like it's cheating. It's basically putting a whole computer on a chip, and it doesn't feel the same to me. But I feel like my sweet spot is keep the original hardware, and whatever upgrades you do to it can be ripped out immediately, so you're right back to the original hardware. I'm okay with that, generally speaking. And that's kind of what I do with my old machine. I mod it as much as humanly possible. But ultimately, if you've got that Chevy on the road, the wheels are still the Chevy wheels. Everything in that Chevy is the Chevy. Maybe you've popped a brand new V8 in there, but you can hoist that out anytime and put original V6 or whatever it was back in there. But that I think that is for me, that's the sweet spot of retro computing when you're actually still using the original hardware. You can smell the original smells. You've got that original touch. It's not brand new. It's the old kit.
Now, we've spoken a lot about the positives in this case, and you just reminded me of the fact that my Tandy 1000 is using an XT with the optional clicker that makes it sound like it's an actual hard drive from
Yeah.
way back then.
Yeah.
There's also the not so positive part, abandonware, archival access, and how um, when preservation conflicts with licensing, even of stuff that the company doesn't even exist anymore. What's your position on that? What community norms do you advocate? And, if you also want to chime in on it, what do you think about the Stop Killing Games initiative that's doing the rounds in the news right now?
Right. Okay. Well, I think first things first, I think the biggest negative about retro computing before going into those is the price is keeping on going up. And I think, we've got people getting into retro computing all the time, whether these are people who grew up in the 90s or the noughties or even the current day, like people who are as young as 21 or 19 or whatever. And they go, hey, look at all these old computers. These are really cool. Um, and but the problem is that things are going up and up and up in price. And I guess that's kind of the same with antiques, right? But it is a bit sad that we're only talking about things that are 40 years old, really. They shouldn't be going up in price as exponentially as they are because that is a barrier to entry that is artificial. People are artificially jacking the price. So I don't like that. I do this stuff for the love of it on my YouTube channel, and so I'm not expecting to profit from it. And some people I have some patrons on my channel that help pay the bills basically, and I receive money from YouTube, but it's nothing. It's hardly anything. That allows me to spend the ridiculous amounts of money to buy parts for these computers, right? Or to buy the computers themselves and then show them off on the channel. And it's just, yeah, it's just a bit sad that that's where the state of retro computing's at. There's people. I bought this card that was pretty rare called the Intel Inboard recently, and that cost me like $1,500. So I could have bought a amazingly good laptop or something like that for that. It's just insane. That's got a 386 processor on it, right? So there is that. I think that is one of the hard things about retro computing. I think that there's a lot of people who don't know what they've got as well and are throwing things out, and that's just, I guess that's tough. But the preservation of both hardware and software is important. Um, I So on the preservation of software, I think there are websites out there like Vitasware, like WinWorld PC. Can't talk too much for the other platforms because I don't use them, but I believe they're very similar. Um, we've all got a lot of preservation out there um, of software, and I think that's really important personally because if you're not doing that, then it becomes very, very hard to make these computers work in the ways that you want. And I think that's just as much for games as it is for application software and so forth. So it all needs preserved. And I think these companies who originally made this software or these games, by and large, are no longer, they're either no longer in business or they're no longer profiting from this software. So if they're enacting copyright laws on them, to what end? Like, what's their target audience for enacting copyright on these? These are softwares that are 40 odd years old, 30 odd years old. Um, so why are we being told to take this down? I mean, who is that serving? So I think that there has to be some sort of give and take, and I think there's a loose kind of honor amongst the thieves here that it's just like, well, unless we get a cease and desist, we're going to keep on providing what is loosely termed as abandonware. And I have no guilt about this because we're not trying to profit from it ourselves, right? We're using this to show something that was of many years ago, or we're trying to use it ourselves to have fun. It's not going to make any of these old products, it's not going to give them any profit in any case. There are exceptions to these cases, of course. There are companies that decide to release their old software in catalogs and send them up on the internet and republish them on websites like Good Old Games or Steam or so forth. It's a difficult position when that kind of thing comes up because you go, well, on one hand, they're entitled, they have a copyright on these things, they're entitled to republish the IP. The thing is that usually it's not the original company that's republishing. It's usually it's like a record label. They keep on publishing their old records just so they can milk the cow that can keep on giving because they recognize that there are people like us who like these old games. It's mainly games. I feel like application software, there's very little competition with these sorts of things out there. But yeah, games, these ones, that's the touchy subject that comes up from now and then, and that it is tough. It is really tough. So
Yeah, probably not. Nobody's going to bat an eye if, you're printing banners on print shop, you know. So yeah, I find really admirable is the work done by several YouTubers that I follow, where they take like the magnetic flux info from 8-inch sugar floppy drives for archival of software that, otherwise would just be lost to time and software that usually is required to get a lot of the hardware back up and running.
that's
So,
right.
and there's a lot of great effort also by people who make software for hardware whose software was lost to time, and you have to
That's right.
reverse engineer the whole thing.
The very, very first thing I did when I got that Intel inboard that I was talking about a moment ago, that came with a driver disk. And I pretty much knew that if, floppy disks, they don't last. They're really starting to die quickly now. Um, and so the very, very first thing I did without even installing the device was literally take that floppy disk out and copy that floppy. Um, I used Michael Brookman's disk image software, but if I had properly, I would have gone out to purchase what's called a grease weasel, which is a hardware device that actually records each track in a almost like a chemical biological way. It's taking it really, really massively back to basics disk image and then posting that. But first thing I did was take that disk image and post it up to archive.org so that other people can benefit from it because unless a lot of the time when you get on eBay you don't get these things in box, you get them secondhand, no manuals, no discs, no nothing. And so if somebody does come across one of these in the future, they will be able to go on the archive.org and find that image. And I think that preservation is incredibly important. And that is the spirit of what archive.org was created for. It was to archive the internet and say, look, these things, they're getting lesser and lesser, harder to find all the time. That's really important. because people weren't thinking about that preservation. And Jason Scott, as I was saying, he created that BBS documentary back in the day. He's the person behind archive.org pretty much. There are lots of other people involved, but he was, the original person. He came up with this website, first of all, called Text Files. And Text Files was basically as much in the way of text files that he could find across the internet that was originally mainly created on the BBS days. He pulled all of that together and created that archive of text files. And so that was kind of like a precursor to the archive.org. Now we're in a very precarious position where the archive website, archive.org, kind of went out on a bit of a limb and did something which was a bit different. So around COVID, they decided to make scanned copies of as many books, physical books, as they could. Now, that I kind of think is crossing the line because these are active press books. They're not 100-year-old books. They
Still
probably
in
have them
print.
too, but these are books that people are selling in bookshops for profit right now. And I kind of feel like that is one stage too far, right? If archive.org started copying all of the existing new games and new software on the market, that's crossing the line too far because these are actively out there. People have worked on these in the current day, and you're basically ripping them off. That is not the same. And they've done that, and they crossed the line, and now there's a lawsuit against them. Now, it would be horrendous for the original hard work of the archive.org sites, which is, petabytes and petabytes of data, for all of that stuff to go away, because mirroring the archive.org is not going to be easy, right? That's, where do you get all that infrastructure? How do you make a mirror of it? There's so many big questions that need to be answered. And if the archive.org got shut down in 6 weeks' time because they lost their lawsuit, we have a big problem on our hands because that information, the good stuff, really does need preservation. And it's a worry of mine. Certainly, we need to do something about that soon.
Yeah, you can't have all the data in the world. Where would you put it?
Yeah.
Now, speaking of preservation, some of the kit that you use today will be vintage in 20, 25 years. What should we as a society be preserving today? What should we do to preserve these things so that future tinkerers can actually use it, be it documentation, hardware, firmware, and things like cloud services?
Yeah. Good question. I mean, I go onto Reddit a lot more now than I used to, and I probably should admit to. And when I look in Reddit, in the vintage computing forums, I'm seeing a new generation of people who felt like, the MacBook Air, for example, is retro because it's the old MacBook Air that was on the Intel chip. And in my head, I'm like, that's not retro. That doesn't count. But who am I to say what's retro, right? Retro to me is the stuff that I grew up with, the stuff that was in the 70s and 80s, and that's important to me. But that's not necessarily what's important to somebody who's lots younger than me. And I think that's your question is really important because somebody somewhere has to, agree that we preserve a number of things of every generation that has importance because 100 years from now, we need to look back and say, this was state of the art at the time, and this influenced decisions in the future that got us to where we are in 2035, for example. So all of that needs to be documented. So you're absolutely spot on about, the manuals as well. Not that we have manuals these days. If you buy, a MacBook Pro or whatever, it comes with a, end user license agreement, and that's about it. But the software and the hardware need to be retained and documented. And I think we're in a bit of a strange time because everything's so locked down, right? Apple, I'm going to pick on you, Apple, because Apple, they're in their most locked down world than they seem to be than ever before. If we go back to 1977 with the Apple II, there was a machine that was massively open. You could plug in all sorts of hardware. You knew the schematics of the hardware Steve Wozniak made a red book that came with it with his own typewriting, his own drawings, and everything you wanted to know about that hardware was there in front of you. So there was great documentation. There was great open hardware design. Everything about it you could just play with. Somewhat similar with the original IBM PC as well, because they used an industry standard architecture and used off the shelf components. Only thing about that was copyright really was the two ROM chips in it. So if we fast forward to where we are today, taking the Apple, for example, it is a completely locked system. It's very difficult to get into it. You need a special screwdriver. You look at the hardware inside of it, there's no documentation about, it's all IP, it's all Apple. So you can preserve the hardware by, putting it in a box, airtight, keeping it safe. And so that will exemplify that hardware in years to come. But what can you say about how it works? Well, you need the testimony of the people that worked and designed that equipment in Apple to be able to fully account for how it was made and why decisions on the design were made. That is a lot harder, because they're under non-disclosure agreements, corporate things all over the place to say, thou shall not talk about these design decisions. Very, very difficult. So in 30 years, 40 years, these NDAs will have lapsed or whatever, and that's fine. But people's memory of how these things came to be, memory is not great. And so I think we're going to have a real struggle with hardware in these devices of today. I think the documentation of things will be harder to get, and there won't be an easy process for obtaining that information. And there's so much dilution of hardware on the same basic principles in the PC era. Everything's it's just the same thing. There's not a lot of special about it. We're driving the same equipment that really was first influenced by a design that was made by Intel and IBM in the early 1980s. And so it's just been an iteration from there. Some could argue it's completely different these days, but really, by and large, the PC industry is not massively different. There are chips and so forth that are completely different, but it's
Yeah,
starting going back
whatever's
to
not,
an architecture of old.
yeah, and whatever's not behind an NDA is behind a layer of glue or epoxy, or it's. I, for one, for example, I'm sad that a lot of for example, Apple devices you mentioned have solid state drives that will wear out eventually, no matter what you do. So it's sad that it's built not to be preserved and not to be learned from as easily. And I also agree, a lot of the stuff that we take for granted today, the CPU on our phones right now, for example, are pretty much the descendants of that first ARM chip, part of that project that you mentioned, the computers from the time of the BBC uh, computer and so on. So yeah, it's sad that a lot of that history might get lost at some point. So it's great that there are, some efforts to preserve a lot of that. Now, looking ahead, what's next for efforts like Back to the BBS and for Al's Retro Geek Lab in the coming months and years?
Um, so I mean, it's a tightrope of balance between what I do in business, which is all consuming. To be honest with you, I'm spending 60 to 80 hours at the moment working on the business. It's seeing a really positive growth at the moment, which is really great. Got a team of wonderful people with me working on that, and I think that we're really delivering some great help for a lot of organizations. So that kind of keeps me busy, and so my efforts is that I try something new on the channel as much as humanly possible. What I really love, though, in Al's Geek Lab is when I do those documentaries. And those documentaries or some of them are just one episode. Some of them are, Alex Kildall and
Gary.
Gary Kildall, sorry, are 3 episodes, and then back to BBS was 8. Those things, those are the things that I do deep dive research on. I try my absolute best to make sure that the facts in those are spot on, that have really been researched. Then you have to pull together all of the, and as a YouTube maker, you'll know this, but for the viewers, you have to spend a lot of time getting together the assets as well and making sure they're not subject to copyright. And you have to make sure you attribute those, and you write your scripts, and you really spend a lot of time recording just the audio part and making sure that sounds right. And then you piece together those media assets, whether that's film or stills, and then edit that all together. That whole process, for example, for that Back to the BBS series took over 6 months of work every single weekend from start to finish. And I would release as I went as well, because I wanted to keep the momentum. And in the end, viewership in the first episode was quite high, but then they trailed off. And I don't really know why. I think there was still, the core people who were really interested in BBSs. They were addicted to it. They loved it. But the algorithm on YouTube is kind of unforgiving. And, it just basically, the numbers sort of trailed off quite significantly after that. And I feel like that's a lot of effort for not necessarily that. We're kind of gamified as human beings, right? We're always kind of like, the bigger numbers are better, so for me it's an awful lot of effort for not necessarily a lot of reward. I like that number to go up and show me that all of that effort was worthwhile, and that's just human nature. But my personal thing is like, let's document all of this stuff of old for the new generations. This is what happened, this is why it happened, and then we can see things. Maybe we make the same mistakes, maybe we won't make the same mistakes. But I find this interesting, this history of why we got to where we got to, fascinating. And all of the things that people don't know about, like the fact that had Gary Kildall, for example, going back to that one, had he been successful in being the person that released DOS to IBM rather than Microsoft wouldn't be here today. I mean, they just wouldn't, right? So that would have massively, massively changed the landscape of the personal computer revolution. And IBM would have been running DR-DOS. They would have been running whatever, Gary Gem, who knows? But would we had better software? Quite possibly. Would we have had less of this closed environment of software? Almost definitely. Would we have had nicer people running the show? 100%. So there's things like that in these documentaries I'm really able to expose and say, hey, there's a really interesting what if scenario about software, about human beings, and about the hardware, and all the juxtaposition of all of these. And I think that is something that I think needs to be documented, because people watch media more than they read books these days. It needs to be documented, and it needs to be factually true. It needs to be something that people really, there's, because on YouTube, there's so many things about this that are just, I watch them and I want to see like the equivalent of the Gary Kildall story. And I watch it and I'm like, no, it's not. That's not how it happened. That's absolutely, the homogenized version. A lot of people say Gary Kildall went flying the day that IBM came knocking on the door. That's not true. So there is so much nonsense and hubris about this that's, if you actually spend time researching, you will find the reality. And that is true of so many things. And who else is going to document it? If you feel like there's a need to document something, you should document it. So that is the reason why I make these documentaries and spend a lot of concerted effort on them. And I will continue to do that as long as I possibly can. But right now, I have less time for it than I would like, but I'll certainly continue to do it as long as I can.
Well, it is a desirable problem. If you had nothing to do, then, it would be a little bit more difficult anyways. Now, for someone discovering retro computing now, and I've seen a lot of it lately, even very young people that I even follow on YouTube, working on machines that are sometimes twice or three times their own age. I find that very encouraging. Because the appreciation for, like you mentioned at the beginning, how all of this was accomplished in spite of the limitations of the hardware, bringing out this creativity that people had at the time. I think that's great. Now, for someone who's discovering retro now, what steps do you recommend for them to get meaningfully engaged in the hardware, in the software, and most of all, in the community action?
Yeah, good question. I think the people who get involved in retro, if we're talking about younger people here, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
or even older people who might not have had the familiarity back then with computers that perhaps you and I have, but want to learn because they have the time, they have the means.
Mm. Yeah, I think that these people obviously have some level of curiosity. They're they're either interested in the history of why we got where we got now, or they're just tinkerers and like the look of it from an aesthetic perspective, or maybe, like you say, the people who aren't young people, they've seen this equipment, or they maybe even worked with this equipment, forgot all about it, and then come back to it many years later. Um, but I think these people are probably, all, whether young or old, are probably curious already to some extent. So they found themselves um, probably potentially by chance with this equipment, right? They've got this old equipment, or maybe they started out in the emulation game, right? They found themselves with an Amiga emulator or an old PC DOSBox emulator or whatever the emulation is, and they're going, actually, this is kind of fun. There's something about it that gets them hooked, whatever it may be. I don't care. It's really irrelevant. If they've got that bug, they've been bitten by that bug, and it says, "Hey, I'm interested." Then I think it. I think the more I learn personally about this old retro stuff, is it fascinates me. It's just bit by bit. I started in the retro computing thing in, I would say, 2005. It must be around then anyway. So I've been into I collected Sun systems and VAX systems and Amigas and BBCs and a whole bunch of things. And my wife at the time, I'm divorced now, but she was probably starting to wonder whether I was a hoarder or not. But I had a whole area of my house devoted to old retro computers. So, as so many people in this case do. That the reality is, these days I only have a limited subset because I only have a limited set of space, and um, those are computers that I want to keep working with all the time. So I can switch them on. They will either be broken, but I can fix up and show it on the channel, and that's the goal. I always only want to have working equipment. But back to the question is really, I think that when I am looking for answers to questions I might have about, hey, how can I fix this equipment, or how can you tell me something about this? I end up going to the forums. So those forums for the PC stuff, or others, are generally things like the VC Vintage Computer Federation forums, Vogons, and a few other ones as well. There's a British one which I've forgotten the name of for some reason right now. And of course, there's the other things like Reddit and so forth, but your mileage may vary with Reddit. I think when you go onto these forums, though, you start finding a whole bunch of people who have a similar interest. Some of these people might be right at the beginning of that journey. Some people might be long beard, been in it from the 60s or 70s or something like that. and they all have an interesting story to tell. And very, very rarely do you get people arguing, right? You get people who are passionate for sure, and then you might get some angst or tension about that. But generally speaking, all of these people are very, very positive, want to help each other out. Um, if I've got a question, invariably somebody answers it for me. But what I also find on these ones, and especially that British one, I wish I could remember, they also have articles on there, and or they repost from articles on the internet that talks about things right back from the von Neumann days, right? Even from that long ago, about the conception of the computer age, all the way through to the modern day. But from that, I see articles, and every now and again, I'm like, oh, I've never thought about that. I wonder what that is. And they might even be short articles, but they talk about the decisions that led to that hardware or that software being made. And so I talk to people like that in the forums, and it's really, really fascinating about and make have a whole new appreciation for how certain software or design decisions were made. Like for example, the IBM PC, the original CPU was this 4.77 megahertz 8088. The 8088 was a crippled processor by all measures, right? It could have been, it was so many wait states on it. It had an 8-bit data bus, a 16-bit main processor, but it's an 8-bit data bus. So it had to put wait states in it to slow it down. So basically, if you looked at the performance of it and you looked at the contemporary 8-bit processors, here's a 16-bit processor, which should be much faster, much better. And if you looked at the contemporary processors like the 6502 and the Z80 or Z80, depending on where you are in the world, you look at those processors and you think those should be slower. They're 8-bit processors. But in actuality, the performance, depending on what you were doing, was actually better on those 8-bit processors, which is crazy. They would run at 1 or 2, 4 megahertz themselves, but really 8-bit processors. The design decision was about how they would make Intel and IBM would make compatibility with off-the-shelf components. Everybody was using 8-bit cards, and so to develop a 16-bit bus with 16-bit cards would have been too expensive at the time. So really, it was about what they could do, and it made absolute sense. But I really couldn't understand that for a very long time, and so understanding that design decision made a lot of sense much later on to me. And if it wasn't for the forums, if it wasn't for understanding these stories, I think it would be really sad. So the forums and the various guides out there are really awesome.
Yeah, and you remind me of how the TMS 9900 was crippled on the TI 99 4A as well. And it was on purpose because they didn't want to compete with their own Texas Instrument mainframe
Yeah.
business at the
Some of
time.
that though, some of that was really crap though. There was a lot of crappy decisions that were made on profit, and I hate those.
Yeah.
But yes, some of it was on purpose because it made a heck of a lot of sense at the time as well. So there was kind of there's two camps. But yeah, I hate that profit one.
Now, for the person that you're referring to on YouTube that's from the UK, I would think John from Retrobytes UK or Peter Lee from Nostalgia Nerd. Maybe it's one of them too.
No, it's not on YouTube. It's an actual computing forum,
Oh, okay.
which has posts, and some of those posts are YouTube posts. But yeah, I mean, look, I think there's never been a better time than right about now to be in retro computing because there is so much interest on it. Um, there's so much hardware, especially if you're in a country like the US or the UK. But there's so much hardware, there's so much software, there's so much availability of information out there, both in the forums, in the blogs, and finally on formats that were just never available, like YouTube, and that's all there now. So there's never been a better time, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And it's hopefully getting better as time goes by. Well, we've covered a lot from origins, security lessons from the BBS days for today's community, how to collaborate with the community, what's next for both your channels and for modern add-ons and classic gear and so on. I would love to, first of all, thank everyone who's still with us. I mean, this has been a pretty long conversation for which I'm really honored that you've shared, a part of your Sunday, your weekend, to talk about all of this with us here. I would encourage you to follow Alistair if you don't follow him already on Al's Retro Geek Lab on YouTube and all his socials, and to check out both Back to the BBS and his documentaries on Gary Kildall and other famous people. I want to thank my crew and my audience for listening to this interview. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it. Please subscribe and keep exploring because today's tools are going to be tomorrow's retro. Thanks again, Alistair.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.